It started with a spilled coffee and the smell of something just slightly burnt. The late April sun had already begun to ripen the air into that soft heat that's never quite comfortable, and the city, like a pot just starting to boil, seethed quietly underneath it. Ezra was standing outside a downtown cafe, eyes glued to his cracked phone screen, swiping absently through half-read messages and ghosted conversations, when he turned too fast and collided with her. Not enough to knock her over, she was solid, not in the physical sense, but in the way a person becomes when they've stopped apologizing for taking up space. His iced latte splashed down the front of her linen dress like a bad joke. He apologized the way people do, too fast, too many times, already expecting an irritated glare, maybe a sharp "watch where you're going, kid." But she surprised him. She didn't yell. Didn't even flinch. She looked down at her stained dress and let out a sound halfway between a sigh and a laugh, soft and unbothered, like she'd already had worse that morning and decided this moment wasn't going to break her. "It's just coffee," she said. "Not a heart attack." Her name, he learned 10 minutes later, was Marianne. She refused his offer to buy her another drink, but allowed him to sit. There was something electric about the ease with which she spoke, not just confident, but disinterested in performing for him, as if she'd long since stopped measuring her worth by how much attention a stranger gave her. She had green eyes that didn't sparkle so much as observe, with lines around them that weren't sad but earned. Her laugh was unfiltered, almost private, like she was letting him in on a joke nobody else was clever enough to hear. He noticed, absurdly, that she had chipped nail polish and a faint burn scar on her right forearm, the kind you get from brushing against an oven door in a hurry. Imperfections that made her seem real, more so than anyone he'd been on a date with in the past 2 years. Everyone at university was trying so hard to be cool, ironic, branded in sleekness. But she? She didn't seem to care who was watching. Their conversation meandered like old friends who forgot to pretend they were strangers. She talked about books, not the kind everyone reads to impress others, but out-of-print novels with yellowed pages and marginalia scribbled by people long dead. He told her about how he used to write poetry when he was 14 and how embarrassed he was by it now, and she told him not to be embarrassed by the parts of himself that tried. When she smiled again, really smiled, it was like watching someone exhale after years of holding their breath. Then came the moment that neither of them expected. He had said something stupid about how he'd once tried to teach himself to cook by watching old episodes of Julia Child and ended up setting off the fire alarm so many times his dorm mates had voted to ban him from the communal kitchen. She laughed, of course. A bright, sharp sound that turned heads at nearby tables. And in that split second of genuine amusement, her face changed. She looked alive. Not just happy, but awakened, as if some part of her had been gathering dust in the attic of herself for years and suddenly someone turned on the light. Ezra didn't say anything. He just looked at her, really looked at her, and maybe that was the moment she realized he wasn't just being polite. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked, half curious, half deflective. He hesitated, then shrugged, a crooked grin playing on his face. "I don't know," he said honestly. "You just smiled like it surprised you." That did something to her. Her expression faltered, softened, then settled into something unreadable. She looked away, down at her hands, where her fingers were tracing circles on the side of her coffee cup. A long pause stretched between them, and he felt the tension build, not uncomfortable, but charged. Like the static before a storm. "No one's made me laugh like that in a long time," she said finally. There was something in her voice, not sadness, not bitterness, but a kind of quiet grief that doesn't ask for pity. And in that moment, Ezra felt something shift in his chest. Not attraction, not yet. Something deeper, older, like recognition. As if she were a song he had only half heard before, and now he couldn't stop humming it. They parted ways with no expectation. No exchanged numbers. Just a mutual glance that lingered 2 seconds too long. But the memory of her stayed with him like an afterimage burned into his brain, one he wasn't entirely sure he was supposed to chase. But he would. Not because it made sense. Not because she fit neatly into the world he knew. But because, for one fleeting moment, he had seen something in her, something fierce and unfinished, and it made him feel less alone. And maybe that was worth everything. It wasn't supposed to become anything. Ezra kept telling himself that the day after, and again the next week, when he saw her at the bookstore near the train station, standing with her back to him, head tilted slightly as she scanned the titles along the shelf. He hadn't expected to see her again, hadn't even remembered the name of the cafe until he walked past it that morning and caught himself slowing down. Marianne didn't notice him at first, not until he spoke her name quietly, like it wasn't meant for anyone else to hear. She turned with a look that was startled, but not unpleasant, like she'd already placed him somewhere in her memory, and wasn't sure if she should be surprised or amused that he was now appearing in the flesh again. He asked if she remembered him, a question that sounded dumb the second it left his mouth, and she answered yes without any hesitation, like she'd been expecting him somehow, though she didn't say that out loud. They walked together without a plan, a slow rhythm building between them again, the way it had at the cafe. She didn't ask what he did, and he didn't ask where she lived. He told her about a professor who'd called his writing too sentimental to be clever, and she snorted and said the only thing worse than cleverness was people trying too hard to be it. He laughed. She didn't smile this time, but he could tell she meant it. The problem wasn't their age, not really, not to them. It was everything else. Ezra was 22, barely through the fog of adolescence, still living in a shared apartment near the university, surrounded by people who used phrases like emotional labor and late capitalism in casual conversation, who posted filtered fragments of themselves on private accounts followed by public followers, who believed everything temporary could still be beautiful as long as it got enough likes. Marianne lived in a townhouse tucked away in a corner of a neighborhood where the houses were far enough apart to avoid small talk and close enough together for the gossip to stay fresh. She worked in some part of city planning that Ezra didn't quite understand, something to do with permits and zoning committees, and she had a 12-year-old Honda with an air freshener shaped like a dog. She told him she'd been married once, and he didn't ask for details, only nodded, because some stories don't belong in a timeline, they live in the silence people leave when they choose not to explain. It became routine faster than he expected. Not a relationship, not officially, not publicly. They didn't meet at his place because his roommates would have asked questions with raised eyebrows and nudging jokes that he wasn't interested in hearing. They didn't meet at hers because she said she didn't want her neighbors seeing his car parked outside and adding two and two in their heads until they came up with their own narrative. So they met in the middle. A parking lot near the river. A bookstore with a cafe tucked in the back where no one knew either of them. Once, she made a joke about feeling like a teenager sneaking around behind her parents' backs, and he told her he was technically the one doing that, which made her laugh too loud. That laugh again, the one he kept chasing, the one that reminded him she wasn't a concept or a milestone, she was just a person who happened to see something in him that made her want to keep seeing it. But people notice things. And nothing stays hidden for long, not in a campus this small. It started with questions. A friend of his saw him getting out of a car that didn't belong to anyone they knew and asked him if he'd started driving a mom's SUV. Then someone overheard him talking about a restaurant he'd been to, one way out past the suburbs, and made a comment about rich dates. He laughed it off the first few times, but jokes turned into guesses, and guesses into gossip, and before long there were whispers about the woman he was seeing, the one he refused to bring to parties, the one nobody had ever seen on social media. He should have known it would happen eventually, but it still caught him off guard when his phone rang late one night, and the name on the screen wasn't one he wanted to see. It was his older brother, Liam, who never called without a reason. Ezra answered and immediately heard the tone in his voice, low and serious, too careful to be casual. Liam didn't ask questions, he just said he'd gotten an email. An anonymous one. With photos. Blurry, grainy, taken through a window, but clear enough to recognize the outline of Ezra's face sitting across from someone who clearly wasn't a girl his age. There was no name, no threat, just the implication hanging in the air like a knife waiting to fall. Ezra didn't say anything for a while. Liam didn't push. When Ezra finally spoke, it was only to say that it wasn't anyone's business. Liam sighed, a long tired breath, and said he didn't care who she was, but Ezra needed to be careful, because people don't always keep things quiet, even when they say they will. And in a city like theirs, where everyone knows someone who knows everyone else, secrets are never buried, just waiting to be turned over by the next careless hand. When he hung up, Ezra sat in the dark for a long time, the screen of his phone still glowing. He wanted to tell her. He almost did. He typed out a message 3 times and deleted each one before pressing send. What would he even say? That someone was watching them? That someone cared enough to send anonymous photos to his family? He stared at the words "Are you awake?" on the screen, thumb hovering over send, and then let it fade to black. If she knew, she'd pull away. If she thought he was in danger, she'd do what she always did, protect herself first, leave before anyone else had the chance to. But he didn't want her to leave. Not yet. Marianne started locking her phone at night. It wasn't a reaction to anything specific Ezra had done, but rather a slow, quiet shift in her behavior that he noticed because she had once been careless about small things. She used to leave it face down on the couch while she got them more tea, or toss it on the kitchen counter without glancing at it twice, and now she kept it close, sometimes turning the screen away from him when she checked her messages. Ezra didn't ask about it. He understood what it meant without needing to hear the explanation. She had sensed it too, the quiet pressure beginning to gather around them, the slow circulation of whispers that had begun to chase them out of the comfort they had built in the corners of their city. They met less often now, only when both of them were sure there was enough distance from eyes that knew how to look too closely. The bookstore was no longer safe. The lot by the river was now too visible. She found a motel outside the city, the kind with doorways that opened directly onto the parking lot, with a sign that flickered and a front desk clerk who didn't ask questions. Ezra hesitated the first time she suggested it. She didn't try to convince him. She only said that they had to decide if the risk was still worth taking. Inside the motel room, everything felt temporary and quiet. The air smelled of cleaning products and fabric softener, and the curtains were always drawn even during the day. They didn't talk much about what was happening outside those walls. Instead, they talked about everything else. Late at night, with the television off and the world reduced to the narrow space between the bed and the door, they asked each other questions that had no point except to be asked. She told him about a neighbor from her childhood who used to water his lawn during the rain, and he told her about a friend who lied about being adopted just to make himself more interesting to girls. She told him that her favorite sound was the clinking of ice in a glass at a dinner party when people still believed in small pleasures. He told her that sometimes he woke up afraid he was going to be ordinary. She said she already knew he wasn't. In those hours, he stopped feeling like someone pretending to understand the world. He didn't need to know how taxes worked or what a mortgage actually meant. She didn't care whether he had a plan or a 5-year trajectory. They spoke to each other without needing to defend who they were. There were no performance requirements, no social obligations. They didn't need to define anything. They were just two people trying to feel something that made sense. But even behind closed curtains, the world has a way of noticing what it shouldn't. It happened on a Sunday. They had left the motel briefly to pick up food from a nearby Thai place, walking back toward the car with paper bags and casual expressions. They didn't hold hands, didn't touch, didn't even stand too close. But it didn't matter. People didn't need physical evidence. They needed a moment that didn't look quite right, a glance that lasted half a second too long, an expression that could be misread and passed around later. Ezra saw the man before Marianne did. He was standing across the street, waiting at the corner, wearing a faded hoodie and a cap pulled low. Ezra didn't recognize him, not at first, but the feeling he got was immediate. The man wasn't just watching. He was calculating. Later, after they returned to the motel room and locked the door behind them, Ezra told her. She didn't ask questions right away. She put the food on the table and sat down on the edge of the bed, quiet. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm in the way that precedes a decision. She said that this was the kind of mistake that couldn't be untangled once it was out in the open. Not the relationship itself, but the way people would react to it. She said that people would focus on the difference in age because they didn't understand anything else, and once that became the headline, nothing else would matter. Ezra said he didn't care what people thought. She said that was because he still believed people would forget. He wanted to fight her on that. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that they could wait it out, that this wasn't some scandal, it was just two people who liked being with each other. But when he looked at her face, he saw something else. Not fear. Not regret. Just exhaustion. She was already preparing for the backlash, already thinking through the steps of what would happen next, already deciding how much she was willing to lose and how much she wasn't. Ezra sat down beside her, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Eventually, she leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, and he let it stay there until her breathing evened out. He didn't sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, thinking about the man on the corner, about how many people knew what they weren't supposed to, about how little it took for something private to become public. He knew they were running out of time, but he didn't know what came after time ran out. Ezra hadn't told anyone by choice, but silence never held forever. One of his closest friends, Micah, found out before he had the chance to think through how it should be said. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. Micah didn't find photos or overhear something explosive. He noticed that Ezra was disappearing too often, taking rides out of the city without explaining where, skipping the usual hangouts, answering questions like he had somewhere more important to be but never naming the place or the person. One evening, while they sat in Ezra's apartment with music playing low from someone else's speaker and 3 half-drunk bottles of cheap wine between them, Micah asked directly, "Who is she?" Ezra didn't respond. He looked at his glass for too long. That pause was enough. "She's not a classmate," Micah said, watching him closely now. "She's not from here." Ezra shook his head once, slowly, without looking up. Micah didn't push. He sat back, drank what was left in his glass, and said nothing more that night. But the next morning, Ezra found a message on his phone. It wasn't aggressive. It just said, "I hope she's good to you, even if this gets ugly." That should have been enough to ease the pressure, but it didn't. It made it real. It meant that now someone else carried the secret, and with that came the risk of interpretation, of repetition, of losing control of the version that mattered most to him. Marianne didn't react the way he expected when he told her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't surprised. She only nodded and asked how close Micah was with anyone who might care about this more than he did. Ezra said Micah didn't gossip, but she reminded him that loyalty and discretion were not the same thing. After that, she changed again. She spoke with more caution, chose her words carefully even when they were alone, stopped answering his calls during the day, asked him not to text her unless they were already on the way to meet. He wanted to fight that. He wanted to tell her that running made it worse, but he knew how she saw the world. It wasn't about paranoia. It was about patterns. She had lived long enough to see how quickly situations like this could turn into stories that didn't end with choice. He kept quiet the week of the conference. Marianne had mentioned it once before, saying she had to give a short talk on zoning regulations and public policy at a regional planning event downtown. Ezra had only half listened at the time, distracted by the curve of her neck or the way her fingers moved while she spoke. But now, after everything, he found himself thinking about it more. She had told him not to come. She said it plainly. Not as a command, but as a boundary. She needed that space to be hers, untangled from what they were doing behind closed doors. Still, on the day of the event, he went. He didn't dress like he belonged there. Everyone else wore suits or polished dresses, shoes that clicked on marble floors, lanyards with badges, professional smiles fixed like armor. Ezra walked in wearing dark jeans, a plain black shirt, and the jacket Marianne had once called too thin to be useful. No one stopped him. He didn't speak to anyone. He stood at the back of the room and watched as she stepped up to the podium, composed and firm, her notes held in one hand, the other resting lightly on the edge as she began. She didn't stumble. She didn't rush. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He felt proud in a way that surprised him. But then it happened. Near the end of her talk, someone recognized him. It was a woman he had met once before, at a friend's birthday party, someone who worked in local media, the kind of person who always knew what was going on before it was public. She walked past him on her way out and paused. She didn't say hello. She didn't even look at him directly. She only muttered, just loud enough for him to hear, "You're not hiding it as well as you think." Ezra didn't respond. He left immediately after, walking out into the street without checking to see if anyone followed. When he got home, he sat down at the table and didn't move for an hour. He didn't text her. He didn't call. He waited for her to contact him, and she did, late that night, after everything had settled. "I saw you," she said over the phone. I know. Why did you come? I wanted to see you in your world. I wanted to be part of something that wasn't just behind a door. There was a pause. Someone saw me talking to you. I figured. He asked me if you were my son. Ezra winced but didn't speak. I didn't answer him, she said. I just walked away. Do you regret that? I don't know yet. Neither of them said anything for a while after that. He wanted to ask what they were doing, what the plan was now that everything was breaking apart piece by piece. But there was nothing she could say that would make it easier. It was already public. Not officially. Not on paper. But in the way people started to talk about her at work, in the way her name showed up in conversations about professionalism and appearances, in the way she got fewer invitations to certain committees and more glances that lingered too long. She didn't blame him. She didn't accuse him. But the silence between them started growing. And once silence begins to grow, it rarely shrinks again. The room was too quiet. Ezra stood in the back again, this time in a rented suit that didn't quite fit him across the shoulders, listening to Marianne's voice echo through the hall, though it didn't sound like her. It wasn't the softness he knew, or the directness she used when she spoke just to him. It was rehearsed, formal, edited for a crowd that already thought they understood what kind of person she was. The event was a public ceremony hosted by the city council to honor several contributors to local development efforts, the kind of gathering with stiff wine, clapping on cue, and conversations that weren't about anyone in the room but would affect all of them by morning. Ezra hadn't been invited, but someone had told him she'd be speaking, and that was enough. She didn't know he was coming, and he had told himself it didn't matter, that he only wanted to hear her once more before everything was out of reach, before the distance became permanent. She stood at the front of the room holding a small plaque that looked like all the others, saying words that were expected of her, thanking committees and departments, name-dropping a few recognizable institutions, pausing where applause was expected. No one else in the room knew what was happening behind her voice, but Ezra did. He could see it in the way her left hand gripped the paper too tightly, in the way she blinked slower between sentences, in the way her eyes didn't settle on anyone in particular. This wasn't pride or joy or even duty, it was endurance. The audience clapped on time. The next name was called. She stepped down. He moved before he could stop himself. Through the side aisle, out the door, into the hallway. He didn't know if she'd follow, didn't know what he'd say if she did, but he couldn't stay inside and pretend it didn't matter anymore. When she finally came through the door behind him, she didn't look surprised. I knew you'd come. I didn't plan to. You never do. He wanted to ask if she was angry, but he already knew the answer. She wasn't angry at him, she was angry at how limited the world was, how little room it gave them to exist without becoming something for other people to dissect. He asked her if they could go somewhere, talk privately, maybe walk for a while, but she shook her head. I don't think I want to hide anymore. You want to tell them here? No. But I'm tired of speaking like none of it happened. He waited. I told my sister, she said. Ezra didn't know she had a sister. She had never mentioned her. She didn't say anything at first. Then she asked if I was going through something. Are you? I'm going through you. That should have felt like something to hold on to, but it didn't. It felt like a fact. He stepped closer to her, only half aware that the hallway was still technically public, that anyone could step through the doors and find them standing too close, speaking too quietly, in a way that would not pass unnoticed. But she didn't move. She looked up at him and said nothing. Her eyes weren't asking him to fix anything. They were asking him what came next. I thought maybe we'd have more time. There was never time. We just stopped checking the clock. I still want you. I believe you. Do you still want me? I don't know how to stop. He reached for her hand, and this time she let him. They stood there in silence, hands together, until the door opened again and someone walked out without looking at them, too distracted to notice or too polite to acknowledge. It didn't matter. The truth was no longer hidden. It was real. Maybe it had been real from the beginning, but now it was visible. Later that night, they sat in her car, parked on a street where neither of them lived. She hadn't started the engine. The windows were half fogged from the inside, and the silence between them had returned, not cold, not distant, just undecided. "I've been offered a position in another district," she said. "A different city. It's temporary, but it would give me some space." He didn't ask if she had taken it already. He didn't want to make her lie. "You should go." "I didn't say I was going." "But you're thinking about it." "I have to." He nodded once. There was nothing to argue with. "I thought we were something." "We were. We still are." She looked at him carefully. "Then what does this mean?" "It means we can't keep doing this like it's private." "Because it's not. It never really was." "I don't want to lose you." "You might. I might lose you too. But if we keep holding this in the dark, we'll destroy it anyway." She didn't respond. She reached over and placed her hand on the side of his face, just briefly, like she was trying to memorize something without taking it away. Then she pulled back. "I want to say something that matters, but everything sounds wrong." "Say it anyway." "I don't regret any of it. Even if I should. I don't regret you either." They sat there a while longer, not making plans, not deciding anything final. When she dropped him off, she didn't kiss him goodbye. She looked at him and said his name once. He stepped out of the car and didn't look back until she was already turning the corner. Later, alone in his apartment, he stared at his phone. There was nothing new. No message. No decision. Just her number, unchanged, sitting quietly in the list. He didn't call. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't know if she was waiting. And maybe that wasn't the point anymore. Maybe some things aren't meant to be finished. Maybe what mattered most had already been said. Maybe the question wasn't whether they would survive it. Maybe the question was whether they had lived it fully enough to let it end.